Distribution should never be underestimated, as in my career I have seen so many hotels completely changing their financial performances only by actually effectively managing their distribution strategy and creating the optimal channel mix. Indeed, if you think about it, distribution is like playing at Tetris. You have all the different pieces that represent all the different channels, and if you combine them in the best way, you get the best revenue and profits to your hotel. And you don't even need to work on pricing or do a lot of tactical activities in order to drive revenues, as they follow suit, following a very healthy distribution that will increase in the end your average rate, your revenue, and your profit. I want to bring you here a real case example of one of the properties I used to work in the past. This hotel used to run a very high occupancy throughout the year, but at a certain point I realized that in some days I was over-dependent on some channels rather than the others. So I took a period of time and analyzed what was the performance of the high occupancy dates versus the low occupancy dates. And on the first table on the top left, you will see that I started from room nights. So I wanted to understand the impact on the business mix in volumes per channel. I want you to concentrate attention on the first two top performing channels, which are direct and wholesalers, as they are part of the exercise. So direct was anything related to direct sales of both online and offline. Wholesalers, we know it's also a segment if we look at that way, but it's a channel because still it has a specific demand and it sells through different sources, both online and offline. So we will consider a channel in this exercise. So if I look at the numbers and I compare the performance of my two channels in terms of volumes contribution on days of over 90%, meaning fully booked, let's say full occupancy dates versus low occupancy dates, what I saw was that my direct channel was actually losing on volumes during high occupancy dates in favor of the wholesaler segment, whose volumes were ramping up to 30% of the total room nights contribution for the property. This made me think that maybe this segment was in a way cannibalizing my direct channel, not leaving any space for this channel to pick up on room nights because they were already taken. Analyzing volumes only is not enough. So the second kind of analysis that I did was on revenue side. So I did exactly the same comparison, high occupancy dates versus low occupancy dates, but in terms of revenue. And what I recorded was exactly the opposite. So even if my direct volumes were lowering during high occupancy, my revenue contribution for the segment was actually higher, meaning I was actually effectively yielding on the rates, leveraging the high compression of demand that was in the market at that time. On the contrary, the wholesalers that were driving high volumes during high occupancy were not contributing that much in revenue during the same dates. So there, I was probably losing some opportunities for incremental revenue. And this was confirmed by the fact that if I compared the variance of average rate between high occupancy versus low occupancy dates, on the direct channel, I was actually increasing by 30%, meaning I was effectively yielding, while on the wholesaler segment, I was growing by only 8%. So there was plenty of opportunity I should start working on for these two segments. When analyzing distribution, just comparing the data on your high-performing days versus low-performing days is not enough. Indeed, in my analysis, I then went much deeper and into a granular level, looking at different months, different weeks, and days of the week. But for the sake of the presentation, we will just stop to the high and low occupancy dates, but you have to be aware that you have to deep down a little bit in order to have the full picture of the situation. Going back to our two segments that we just highlighted, where I had to put my attention on at that time, I started then looking at the different factors that might have contributed to that performance in order for me to understand where I should work on in order to improve my channel mix. So the first factor that I looked at was booking window, which is very important as it may change based on the channel of distribution. Indeed, I realized that the booking window for my wholesale channel was much longer than the booking window on my direct channel. That means that the guests were booking much far in advance, and when it came for me the time to be in my lead time curve, in my real booking window, regular one, most of the rooms were already sold to the wholesalers. So the space left for sale for me was very limited. And that was one of the first critical points I wrote down to analyze and act on. Second one was the average stay. So I had a look at the different average length of stay per channel. And here I didn't find any differences, but still it's one of those elements you need to consider when looking at your channel mix. Third factor was the real incremental revenue. We don't have to forget that we don't just sell rooms, but we sell the hotel as an asset and as a whole. So in the view of a total revenue management perspective, we really need to understand per channel as well, what's the extra revenue contribution that comes from the guests. So what does each channel bring to the table? If the guest is just transactional, meaning coming, spending the night and just leaving, or if he uses also some facilities at the hotel, like restaurant, spa, or anything else that we have available. So in this case, there was a positive point for wholesalers because I saw that actually the real incremental revenue was, and the extra revenue was positive. So they were spending pretty much in line also to the other segments and to the retail on the extra products. On the geo-source, there was not really a plus, as actually the markets where the guests came from for the wholesalers channel was my main feeder market. So if you look at the different channels from a geographic source perspective, you should consider whether they bring revenue and demand from countries you normally are not able to target directly or are not really contributing so much to your property. In terms of cancellation, I didn't record a high cancellation ratio for this segment that was pretty much in line to all the other segments. Room type sold is another important element you have to consider when analyzing your channel performance, as the way the room types are booked might impact your remaining inventory left to sell, but also your average rate and overall strategy. So in this specific case, I realized that, as I expected, the most sold room types for the wholesalers channel were the basic and the entry room types. And this was, of course, also one of the reasons why I saw so much difference in rate compared to the direct channel. On the inventory side, besides the analysis that we already did on the high occupancy versus low occupancy dates, I also found out that most of the demand coming from this channel was concentrated in what we call the high season and during weekends, which at that time represented for us, of course, the higher demand dates. So this is another important factor to put into your considerations, because when you're working with distribution channels, you want to make sure that they bring revenue and profits possibly where you need them to. And so when they just concentrate on high occupancy dates where you actually could do without them, it's just a loss of revenue opportunity. On the pricing side, I ran an analysis calculating the variance between the direct channel's average rate and the wholesaler rate. And I found out that in a period of time that I took as a reference, the difference was a minus 42%, meaning wholesalers were running an average rate that was minus 42% compared to the direct channels. It might look like a big number, and it is, as we have to consider the net rates, but above all, also the promotions and everything that we put in place. In my case, I had promotion for these specific channels, early booking promotions and long stay promotions throughout the days. And this, of course, impacted on the overall performance for the channel. Another factor is the customer lifetime value, and it's important to understand because we need to understand if the guests that are coming from a specific channels are valuable guests that are going to return, or are just transactional guests that are staying once and they won't come back ever. So it's very difficult to measure, we understand that, but in the end, what I realized is that this kind of customers coming from these specific channels were making their trip of a lifetime. So they were probably not so much of a returning customers that used other channels of distributions to book. And last but not least is the cost per sale. So I already anticipated this on the pricing topic, but when we consider how much a distribution channel costs, yes, there's a cost related to commission, but there's also a revenue loss linked to wrong promotions or promotional activities or discounts that you run on a specific channel. And if you sum both of them together, in the end, it's a missed opportunity that you need to work on. So we just saw that there are so many elements you can consider when analyzing your channel mix. But in this specific case, I concentrated my attention in the 4 that really were impacting my performance. So starting from the booking window, as we said, I realized that the booking window on my channel of distribution in question, my wholesale channel, was actually longer than my regular booking window. And it might be longer because of a natural kind of demand, but also because I realized that a great part of the bookings came with the early bird promotions. So I decided to just modify those early bird promotions, not making them so much wide, so put more restrictions in place and link them to specific room types. As going back to the second point, room types, so we saw that the most sold room types actually for the channel were the base room types. So my early bird promotions were actually targeting the superior room types, as in that way I could try to discriminate the demand, but at the same time attract with some promotional activity some early bird bookers. On the room type side, there was so much I could do. So besides working on the early bird promotion, I started making different considerations also in terms of the inventory allowed to this channel. As I worked in direct connectivity with this channel, I started limiting the inventory, not giving them the full inventory accessible, but limiting the inventory, placing some restrictions on minimum length of stays just for that specific channel on some date in order to limit the availability for sale. Or why not also increasing actually the number of room types that they had available, because sometimes you might think that for some channels just 1 or 2 or 3 room types are enough. This is not the case, because you might want to increase the upselling as well. So you might also want to consider the other way around and increasing the room types available, especially when you decide to work on the inventory levels. So restricting the inventory in some periods could be a great way for you to limit the demand, play at your own rules, but at the same time drive the upselling as well. So this is again linked also to the pricing and inventory levels. So we saw that we had a pricing issue and the price was minus 42% compared to the direct channels rate. So increasing the different room types, playing with the inventory, limiting the inventory sometimes on some days, but also changing the promotions, as we saw that their demand from this channel was concentrated on peak demand dates and specifically on weekends and high season. So I completely stopped the promotions on those periods, but not stopped in a way that I completely ended, but I just shifted them to other periods, meaning if naturally had promotions linked to the length of stay that were falling over the weekends, where most of my demand came from, I just decided to stop linking into the weekend, but putting a mandatory arrival date to a Sunday and a Monday. So then my weekends were untouched by and were not affected. And I had the full rate over my high compressed dates. All of these considerations, of course, are risky, but I already saw that my geo source from this specific channel reflected my main feeder markets. So I was confident to make these choices because the risk was minimal, considering that I knew that being my feeder markets, demand would come anyway. So there are many decisions you have to make when you have to balance the different channel mix and distribution. Sometimes you might be right, sometimes you might be wrong, but it's all a matter of making the right decisions based on data. And if they don't work, you might just go back and restart over, and it's okay. In revenue, in marketing, in our commercial role, we have to be pioneers for the good of our hotel and for the good of our profits. The effects of a change in the distribution mix don't happen overnight, and indeed it took me 2 years to get to the levels I wanted it to be when I started this specific process. And in those 2 years, I had to go back, revise, change, do it all over again, because distribution is evolving, and as such, you have to evolve as well and be always on top of what is happening in order to get it right. Anyway, after those 2 years, I was able to keep the volumes of these two segments in line with the levels of when I started. So I didn't grow so much in volumes, but I completely shifted the mix because my direct channels grew and in volumes, while my wholesalers' volumes dropped by 12%. The positive note came from the average rate. As an effect of much more space left to sell for my direct channels over high peak dates where I was cannibalized by wholesalers, my overall average rate benefited. And also the wholesale average rate grew because I just changed or stopped those kind of promotions that were impacting on my rate and just limiting inventory and availability for sale on dates where I didn't need them to sell. In the end, my revenues increased by 34%. And this is only by creating the optimal distribution mix. So you can see how much powerful it is and how important it is to analyze this kind of data. In this exercise, I didn't use an OTA as an example on purpose, and I just used another distribution channel like the wholesale, because you can see from this that it's actually the logic applies to any distribution channel. So the logic that we applied here are obviously possibly to be applied anywhere. So I invite you to go back to your hotels, draw your strategy, but remember, when you have to deal with distribution, it's a jungle. It's ever evolving and changing. So draw your strategy in line and be ready to change.